God, we pray that as we turn our hearts and our minds to this story of Esther, Lord, that you would use this time to change us, to form us, to shape us, that we might be your people. Just as the people in the Old Testament were your people, just as the community of Christ followers in the New Testament were your people, we are called to be your people in the world in which we live. And we pray that your word would not just equip us, but also inspire us to do that. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray these things. Amen. About 2.5 millennia ago, in the kingdom of Persia, in the royal residence at Susa, there sat on the throne a ruler named Xerxes. Now, according to remembrances, and it needs to be said that these are remembrances that Xerxes commissioned for himself, Xerxes was, quote, the great king, the king of the land of many tribes, the king on this wide and far-stretching earth. Well, other historians and theologians and truth-tellers have remembered Xerxes differently. If I were an Old Testament prophet or a John the Baptist type, I could probably come up with a colorful way of describing Xerxes, a way that wouldn't cost me my job. But as it stands, I'll just say that Xerxes was a bit of a jerk. Actually, he was a total jerk. Like many rulers, Xerxes had an ego problem. This was compounded by an anger problem, which was further compounded by a drinking problem. And so when Xerxes wasn't throwing his weight around, he was throwing his money around. He was showing off and acting out. And needless to say, when all of this was going on, Xerxes had a knack for making bad decisions in less than rational ways. And so it came to pass that in the midst of one of Xerxes' parties, one of his major blowout Persian fiestas, a party that lasted more than 6 months, a party during which no expense was spared and no restraint was displayed, Xerxes found himself, according to one account, in high spirits. And Xerxes decided that he wanted to parade his beautiful queen in front of all his chief officials, to make it clear to everyone in attendance that he, Xerxes, the great king, the king of the land of many tribes, could land a wife like that. And so he sent for his queen. Her name was Vashti. He sent to her with the request, more of a demand really, that she drop everything, she leave her own party with her own friends, and she join him and his bigwig buddies at their banquet. And when Vashti received the king's summons, quite shockingly, she refused. Now maybe the smart thing for Xerxes to do in this situation would have simply been to shrug it off and then sleep it off. But Xerxes wasn't in the business of making smart decisions. And as is so often the case, his friends didn't help much in this situation. The royal officials who made their living advising the king were distressed. They were distressed by Vashti's mini rebellion for a number of reasons. The main reason was because they were afraid their own wives might follow her lead. Their own wives might form opinions of their own. And even worse, their own wives might act on those opinions. And so at the urging of his nobles, Xerxes banished Vashti from his presence forever. And then he issued a decree. And this decree, which could only be issued by someone like the king of Persia, stated that from henceforth every man would be the ruler over his own household. Now sometimes the choices that we make in the heat of the moment don't always seem so great upon further reflection. And while Xerxes' decree may have helped him save face, it cost him his wife. And inevitably, even for someone as ego-driven as Xerxes, king of Persia, loneliness set in. And he came to regret his actions. Now when they saw how despondent he was, Xerxes' attendants proposed a solution. Let's get Xerxes a new wife, a better wife, a more beautiful wife. We'll hold a contest in which the most beautiful, charming, and unopinionated women from all over the kingdom will compete for his hand. It will be an unbelievable success. And because this seemed like a wonderful idea to Xerxes, he said okay. Now, if you've read the book of Daniel, you know what things were like for the exiles. We talked about this a few weeks ago. If you've read the book of Ezra, which we talked about last week, you know that under Cyrus, the king of Persia, A number of those exiles who had been carried off to Babylon and had lived there for a period of about 70 years returned to Jerusalem. There they renewed a life for themselves. They renewed a life for their children in the land of promise. But what you may not know is that a number of the exiles, now living in Persia, chose not to return to Jerusalem. They stayed in Persia. For some, this was a political decision. They had made a place for themselves within the ranks of the government. For others, it was a financial decision. Business was thriving in their new home. They didn't want to turn their backs on that to go back to a Jerusalem that lay in ruins. And for still others, the decision was a cultural one. They had more or less been assimilated into the Persian way of life. So they weren't eager to go back to a place that they had never really known. Whatever their reasons, these Jews remained a kind of comfortable minority within the Persian Empire. But just because these Jews were comfortable in their new home, just because, as the slide we saw a few minutes ago said, God might have seemed distant or even absent to some of these people, it doesn't mean that God wasn't present. It doesn't mean that God wasn't working. Among these Jews was a man named Mordecai. And Mordecai served in the king's palace. Mordecai was a faithful servant to the throne. Mordecai was also an adoptive father to his younger cousin, a girl named Esther, or Hadassah. And when the king's contest was announced, Mordecai brought Esther to the palace. He entrusted her to a servant named Hegai. And Hegai oversaw Esther's months of preparation for her meeting with Xerxes. Like so many other characters that we've encountered in Scripture, like so many of Abraham's children before her, from Joseph to Daniel, Esther immediately found favor among her overseers. They treated her well. They did everything they could to help her win the contest. However, they didn't know that she was Jewish. Mordecai had instructed her to keep her ethnicity a secret in order to avoid persecution. And so when the time came for Esther to visit Xerxes, the king was immediately taken by her. He was immediately charmed by this young, beautiful woman, and Esther became his queen. So once more, Xerxes threw a great party. But this time it was to share his joy at having found a wife who pleased him. But all was not well in Xerxes' domain. While he celebrated his new bride, a pair of officials, his supposedly loyal officials, conspired to murder him. Fortunately, though, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. He overheard the plot. He reported it to his cousin, Esther, and she reported it to her husband, the king. The plot was foiled. The perpetrators were punished in a particularly brutal way. And Mordecai, the hero who had saved the king's life, was acknowledged for his loyal vigilance. But as the stories that we've encountered throughout Scripture, especially the stories of exile, stories of people like Joseph and Daniel, as these stories bear witness, life is never easy for an exile, even one who has proven him or herself worthy. No sooner had Mordecai single-handedly exposed the assassination plot against the king than he faced opposition, this time from another official, Haman. Haman was a highly appointed nobleman. Xerxes had honored Haman with a lofty position within the empire. And so it was expected that everyone who saw Haman would bow down before him and would pay him the reverence due his office. But for Mordecai, this was a problem. Mordecai had certainly become assimilated to Persia in some ways, but he drew the line at bowing down, paying reverence to a human being, because he felt that he should only bow in that way before God. As you can imagine, when Haman realized this, he didn't take it lightly. This did not sit well with Haman. When he found out about Mordecai's insolence, he was enraged at Mordecai. And when he found out the reasons behind it, he wasn't just angry at this one Jew, Mordecai. Haman was angry at all Jews. He vowed to make them pay for Mordecai's insubordination. And so Haman, puffed up with pride, seething with rage, went to his boss, King Xerxes. And he leveled this charge against the Jews. He said, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for his royal treasury. Well, the king thought that all of this sounded very reasonable. We can't have those dangerous people who don't fit in running around my kingdom. So he told Haman that he could keep his money, but he could do as he pleased toward these enemies of the state. So Haman summoned up all the royal secretaries. He drew up papers that sealed the fate of the Jewish exiles living in the land. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, officials in every province would be commissioned to annihilate the Jews in their territory and to plunder their goods. When Mordecai heard of this edict, he was despondent. He tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He grieved for the oppression of his people. Following his lead, Jews throughout the empire likewise responded in lament. When Esther heard about the despair of her cousin Mordecai, she was intent on finding out why. And so through a messenger, she learned of the edict against her people. But like a lot of us maybe would, she wondered what she could do about it. Mordecai asked her to enter Xerxes' presence and plead on behalf of her people. But she wavered. As she saw things, it was risky to approach the king without being summoned. And indeed it was. For her to enter the king's chamber with a request, without the king explicitly asking her to be there, that was to put herself in danger. She wasn't sure if she could do that. But Mordecai's answer to his cousin's hesitancy was powerful. Beyond that, Mordecai's answer is a strong reminder of the ways that God can work, the ways God is at work to achieve his purposes through people. Mordecai says, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." For such a time as this. This is the moment. This is why you were made queen over this land. This is why you were put in the position. It wasn't just so that you could enjoy nice food and nice clothes and the comfort of the palace. Because if you think all of those things are going to save you, they aren't. It was for such a time as this that you have come to your royal position. Well, when Esther heard her cousin's words, she resolved to be silent no longer. She resolved to speak up on behalf of her oppressed people. She would put herself on the line for the cause of justice. She would approach the king. But before she did, she asked that Mordecai and every Jew living in the province of Susa would join her in a period of fasting and prayer as she readied herself for this mission. Reflecting on the perilous nature of what she was about to do, she speaks courageous but simple words. She says, "If I perish, I perish." Well, after 3 days, Esther put on her royal robes and she went to the king's inner court. She kind of hung around in the inner court, kind of waiting to be seen. And when Xerxes saw her standing there, rather than responding in anger, as she feared he might, he welcomed her into his throne room. In fact, he invited her to make a request. "I'll give you anything," he says, "up to half the kingdom." Well, her entreaty wasn't half the kingdom. It was much simpler than that. She said, "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come to a banquet I have prepared." So Haman and Xerxes joined Esther at table. And as they were eating the meal she had prepared, as they were drinking the royal wine, Xerxes asked again, "What would you like me to do for you? Anything?" And Esther responded, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another banquet tomorrow, and I will answer your question." When the banquet was over, Haman left the banquet hall. As you might imagine, Haman was pretty full of himself. He was buoyed up by the wine and by the prospect of another meal with the king and queen. Nothing could spoil his mood. Almost nothing. Because when he saw Mordecai at the gate, and Mordecai refused to bow to him. It was like a dark cloud descended on Haman. He went home to his wife and his friends, and he vented. He boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Haman's wife, Zeresh, responded quickly. She said, have a pole constructed, 75 feet high, and in the morning go to the king and ask to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go to the banquet and enjoy yourself. So it was decided. Haman had the pole set up, and then he slept like a baby, dreaming of the vengeance he would take on his enemy. But if Haman slept well that night, Xerxes did not. Xerxes was plagued with insomnia. I like to think it was divinely ordained insomnia. And so he had an official bring his favorite scroll to read to him. Unsurprisingly, Xerxes' favorite scroll was a book about himself. It was a record of his reign. But perhaps more serendipitously, or you would probably say more providentially, this particular scroll dealt with a particular incident in his reign, the foiled assassination plot that Mordecai had uncovered. When Xerxes was reminded of this story, he asked his officials, what has been done to honor Mordecai for this? Nothing, his attendants answered. And as the sun was rising, Xerxes noticed someone milling about out in his court. Who's out there? He asked. He found out that it was Haman, who had come early in the morning with his request. And when Xerxes saw Haman out there, he brought him in to ask him a question. Before Haman could make his own request about impaling Mordecai, Xerxes inquired, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now, Haman being Haman, he assumed the king was talking about him. So he answered, well, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. You can imagine Haman's expression when Xerxes responded, that is an excellent idea. Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman, instead of getting to impale his enemy, was forced to parade Mordecai through the streets, trumpeting his enemy's heroism to everyone within earshot. Then he had to go home and get ready for his banquet. Well, this time Esther no longer demurred when the king asked her what her request was. Instead, she answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. Well, Xerxes was distressed. He was distressed to hear that someone would be threatening the lives of his queen and her people. He was even more distressed when Esther revealed the perpetrator of the plot, the king's esteemed official, Haman. At this point, Haman's fate was sealed. One of the king's attendants immediately offered a suggestion about what to do with him. You know he offered. Haman recently constructed a huge pole in his own front yard. He was going to impale Mordecai on it. Xerxes didn't need to be told twice. He impaled Haman on that pole, he ordered, and they did. And so with Haman out of the way, Esther and Mordecai were safe. But the rest of the Jews were still in danger. You might remember something about the way that Persian government functioned. We talked about this when we talked about Daniel, and also when we talked about Ezra. No one, not even the king, could repeal the law of the Persians and Medes. But a king could introduce new amendments into his laws. And so Xerxes issued a second edict to go along with the one about the annihilation of the Jews. This one empowered the Jews living throughout his empire to defend themselves when attacked. If any of the Persians, in response to the earlier decree, took up arms against the Jews, they were encouraged to defend themselves, to defeat their enemies, and to take their plunder. And so word spread, and when the Jews living throughout the provinces heard about this development, they celebrated and gave thanks to God. And when the appointed time came, and a number of Persians, kind of feeling their oats, attacked them, they defended themselves. They killed an enormous number of their enemies, but they left the plunder alone. They didn't plunder their enemies to keep their treasures for themselves. And Mordecai wrote down a record of the events that had unfolded in the province of Susa, and he sent letters to all the Jews. He encouraged them to establish a feast called Purim. It's a feast that's still celebrated even today. It was a feast that celebrated their victory over their enemies. It was a feast that honored the bravery of Esther, an unlikely hero who rose up from anonymity, an orphan girl raised by her uncle, who became queen, and who then responded to a difficult situation with courage by putting herself on the line, by choosing to identify with her people instead of using her high position as a way of escaping hardship. Purim was a feast that reminded the Jews of the demise of their enemy Haman. But more than all of that, Purim was and is a feast that pointed to a God who had not abandoned his people. A God who, while he may have seemed distant, had borne with his children, even in exile. A God who, while he may have seemed absent, provided help when they were at their most desperate. A God who had allowed the children of Abraham, cut off from their homeland, threatened by their oppressors, to survive. But more than surviving, he had allowed them to flourish. And even more than flourishing, he had allowed his children to bear witness to his glory. Please pray. God, we thank you for this interesting, at times funny, foreign, at times strange story of Esther. The story of a brave woman. The story of her cousin, a faithful man. The story of your people who face almost certain annihilation. The story of evil men who seek to do harm to those who bear your name. But above all that, Lord, it's a story of you. As many people have pointed out, Esther is the one book in the Bible where your name does not appear. And yet, when we read it, there can be no mistaking that you're present. Because from beginning to end, we can see you at work, writing the life story of Esther, working through the events of her story and Mordecai's story and Xerxes and Haman's story, and the stories of all the thousands upon thousands of anonymous Jews living throughout Persia. It's a story of redemption, a story of salvation, a story of hope and celebration when things could have gone terribly wrong. A story of you watching out for your children. So God, I pray that this would be a story that we would be reminded of when we struggle, when we feel like our backs are up against a wall, when we feel as though the things in our lives, the enemies in our lives, the sins and the darkness and the struggles, the problems, the challenges we face seem to overwhelm us. Lord, remind us through the story of Esther and stories like Esther that you are not a God who abandons your people, but you are a God who bears with your people. Help us to live each day in that reality. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen.